The cold wind whipped through the bustling city streets as Eleanor Kensington, a woman accustomed to luxury, took a hesitant step onto the sidewalk. But today, she wasn't dressed in her usual designer clothes. Instead, she wore a tattered hoodie, oversized jeans with frayed hems, and scuffed sneakers that barely held together. Her usually flawless golden hair was now tucked under a beanie, and a layer of subtle makeup gave her face a worn-out, exhausted look. For years, Eleanor had lived in a world where money could buy anything. But could it buy kindness? That was the question that had haunted her ever since she overheard two wealthy friends mocking the homeless at a gala the week before. "They're just lazy," one had scoffed. "If they really wanted to, they'd change their lives." So, she decided to find out for herself. Would people truly turn their backs on someone just because of how they looked? She clutched a small, empty coffee cup and walked toward the first cafe she saw. It was a trendy spot, packed with well-dressed professionals sipping lattes and typing on laptops. Taking a deep breath, she approached the counter. "Excuse me," she began, her voice softer than usual. "I haven't eaten today. Would you happen to have any extra food?" The barista, a young woman with bright red lipstick and thick-rimmed glasses, barely glanced at her. "Sorry, we don't do handouts." Eleanor nodded, swallowing her pride. That was expected. She tried again at a small diner down the street. This time, the waitress looked at her in disgust. "We're a business, not a charity. Move along." By the third rejection, her stomach twisted, not from hunger, but from something deeper. For the first time in her life, she was invisible. But just when she was about to give up, a voice called out from behind her. "Wait." Eleanor turned around, her heart pounding. Had someone finally seen her? Eleanor turned, her heart pounding, as she saw a young girl, no older than 16, jogging toward her. The girl had long chestnut hair tied in a messy ponytail, her jeans slightly ripped, and her oversized hoodie suggesting she had worn it for years. But what caught Eleanor's attention most were her eyes, warm, sincere, and filled with something no one else had shown her that day. Compassion. "Are you hungry?" the girl asked, slightly out of breath. Eleanor hesitated. She had played this moment out in her mind, expecting only rejection. But now, facing this unexpected kindness, she felt something unfamiliar, a lump forming in her throat. "Yeah," she finally managed to say, her voice unsteady. The girl smiled. "Come on, I know a place." Eleanor followed her through the busy streets, the cold wind still biting. But somehow, she no longer felt quite as frozen. They stopped at a small food truck, its bright neon sign flickering as the scent of warm pastries and coffee filled the air. "2 sandwiches, please," the girl told the vendor, pulling out a few crumpled bills from her pocket. Eleanor's eyes widened. "You don't have to." The girl waved her off. "It's just food. No one deserves to go hungry." As they sat on a nearby bench, Eleanor studied the girl carefully. She wasn't wealthy. In fact, her clothes suggested she wasn't far from struggling herself. "Why did you stop for me?" Eleanor finally asked, voice softer than before. The girl took a bite of her sandwich before shrugging. "Because it's the right thing to do." Then she smiled, a little embarrassed. "And because my mom used to say, the way you treat people when no one is watching is who you really are." Eleanor swallowed hard. That simple sentence hit deeper than anything she had heard in years. But before she could say anything else, a sharp voice interrupted them. "Maddie, what are you doing?" Eleanor turned to see a woman storming toward them. Older, well-dressed, and visibly furious. Maddie stiffened. Eleanor's stomach twisted. Something told her that this moment was about to change everything. Maddie flinched at the harsh tone, her shoulders instinctively tensing as the woman, her mother, stopped in front of them. She was elegantly dressed in a fitted coat, her expensive handbag dangling from her wrist. Her sharp eyes darted between Maddie and Eleanor, her lips curling in disapproval. "What are you doing with her?" she demanded, gesturing toward Eleanor as if she were something unpleasant. Maddie shifted uncomfortably. "I was just helping." "Helping?" Her mother scoffed. "You don't know these people. They take advantage of kindness. The moment you turn your back, they'll steal from you." Eleanor clenched her jaw, swallowing the sharp retort rising in her throat. She had expected rejection, but seeing it come from someone's own mother, toward her own daughter, felt like a new level of cruelty. Maddie, however, stood her ground. "That's not true," she said, her voice firmer than before. "Not everyone who's struggling is a bad person." Her mother let out a humorless laugh. "You're so naive." Then she turned to Eleanor, her gaze cold and condescending. "I don't know what your plan was, but whatever sob story you told my daughter, it ends now. Go beg somewhere else." The words struck deeper than Eleanor had anticipated. But more than that, it stung to see Maddie's face, flushed with shame, not for helping, but for being treated like a fool for doing so. Eleanor slowly stood up, dusting off her worn-out hoodie. "I didn't ask her for anything," she said calmly, meeting the woman's glare. "She was just kind enough to care when no one else did." Maddie's mother rolled her eyes. "Save it. People like you always have an excuse." Then, grabbing her daughter's arm, she hissed, "We're leaving. Now." Maddie shot Eleanor a helpless glance, her lips pressed into a tight line, before she was pulled away. Eleanor remained rooted in place, watching them disappear into the busy street. For the first time all day, she wasn't hurt by rejection. She was hurt for Maddie. And deep down, she knew this wasn't the last time they'd meet. Eleanor sat back down on the bench, her untouched sandwich growing colder in her hands. The city bustled around her, indifferent as ever, but inside her, something had shifted. For the first time in her life, she had seen kindness challenged, not by circumstances, but by the very people meant to nurture it. She had expected to be ignored, maybe even mocked, but watching Maddie's kindness be dismissed, as if compassion itself were foolish, left an ache in her chest deeper than any rejection she had faced that day. As she sat in silence, a soft rustling sound made her look up. Maddie stood a few feet away, hesitating, her face filled with conflict. "She thinks I came straight home," Maddie muttered, shoving her hands into her hoodie pockets. "But I couldn't just walk away like that." Eleanor felt warmth spread through her despite the cold air. "You don't have to prove anything to me," she said gently. Maddie shook her head. "It's not about proving anything." She hesitated, kicking a loose pebble near her foot. "It's about doing what's right, even when no one else thinks you should." Eleanor studied her, truly studied her, and saw something she hadn't seen in a long time. Genuine, unshaken belief in the goodness of people. It was rare, and it was powerful. "That's not easy," Eleanor said. "Standing up against the people closest to you." Maddie sighed. "I know, but if I don't, then who will?" Eleanor felt a lump rise in her throat. She had spent years surrounded by people who measured worth in wealth, who saw kindness as weakness. But here, in front of her, was someone who had nothing to gain from kindness, yet chose it anyway. For the first time that day, Eleanor smiled. "Then you're stronger than most people I know." Maddie's face brightened for a moment before turning serious again. "Look, I don't know what your story is, and I won't ask. But whatever happens, don't let people like my mom make you think you're less than anyone else." Eleanor inhaled deeply. She had come here expecting to learn about others. Instead, she was learning about herself, and she had a feeling this was just the beginning. Eleanor looked at Maddie, her heart heavier than she expected. This girl had no idea who she was talking to. She didn't know that the woman sitting before her in tattered clothes had once signed multi-million-dollar deals in towering offices. Yet, despite her worn-out disguise, Maddie had treated her with more dignity than people who had dined with her at five-star restaurants. A soft smile crossed Eleanor's lips. "You know," she said, adjusting her beanie, "you're a rare kind of person." Maddie laughed, shaking her head. "I don't know about that. I just try to do what feels right." The words struck Eleanor in a way she hadn't anticipated. When had she stopped doing what felt right? Before she could respond, Maddie's phone vibrated in her pocket. She pulled it out, her eyes widening at the screen. "I have to get back," she said quickly, stuffing the phone away. "She'll check my location soon." Eleanor nodded, expecting Maddie to turn and leave. But instead, the girl hesitated. "Do you have a place to stay?" Eleanor blinked, caught off guard. If you don't," Maddie interrupted, her voice filled with quiet determination, "there's a shelter a few blocks away. It's not much, but they have warm beds. I can walk you there." Eleanor felt something unfamiliar tighten in her chest. No one had ever looked at her and assumed she needed help before. It was always the other way around. She nearly told Maddie the truth. Nearly let her know that she wasn't just another struggling person on the street. But something held her back. If she revealed herself now, would Maddie feel betrayed? Would she think it was all a joke? Instead, Eleanor simply nodded. "That would be nice." As they walked side by side through the city streets, Eleanor realized something. She had come here looking for proof that kindness still existed, and she had found it. But now, a new question lingered in her mind. What would happen when Maddie discovered the truth? As they walked through the dimly lit streets, Eleanor kept stealing glances at Maddie. This girl had no idea how much she had already changed her. The wind was sharp against their skin, but the silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was filled with something deeper, an unspoken understanding. After a few blocks, they reached a modest shelter tucked between two rundown buildings. A faded sign read Hope Haven. Maddie pushed the door open, leading Eleanor inside. The warmth hit her immediately. The scent of hot soup lingered in the air, and the low murmur of conversations filled the space. Volunteers moved around, handing out blankets and guiding people toward cots. It was nothing like the cold, indifferent world Eleanor had known. Maddie smiled at an older woman behind the counter. "Hey, Mrs. Callahan. I brought someone new." The woman, in her 60s with kind eyes and silver-streaked hair, gave Eleanor a warm look. "Welcome, dear. You can stay as long as you need." Eleanor nodded, her throat tight. She wasn't actually homeless, but for some reason, the thought of leaving this place so soon felt wrong. They sat at one of the tables, a bowl of soup placed in front of each of them. Maddie dug in immediately, but Eleanor hesitated. She had eaten in the finest restaurants, yet this simple meal felt more important than any five-course dinner she had ever had. "Why do you come here?" Eleanor finally asked, watching Maddie curiously. The girl swallowed her food and shrugged. "Because I know what it's like to feel invisible." Eleanor's fingers tightened around her spoon. She wasn't expecting that answer. Maddie took a deep breath. "My dad left when I was 10. My mom did everything she could, but we barely got by. There were days when we didn't know where our next meal would come from. She gave a small, bittersweet smile. People like my mom. They work hard, but life just keeps knocking them down. Eleanor felt her chest ache. Maddie wasn't just kind. She understood struggle in a way Eleanor never had. And what about your mom? Eleanor asked carefully. Maddie's expression darkened slightly. She thinks helping people makes you weak. That if you can't pull yourself up, then you're not trying hard enough. She looked away. I don't agree. Eleanor swallowed hard. This girl, this stranger, had no idea who she really was. Yet somehow, she had just taught Eleanor something that no billionaire's advice ever could. And for the first time in years, Eleanor felt something she thought she had lost: hope. Eleanor sat in silence, absorbing Maddie's words. The girl had experienced real struggle, yet she still chose kindness. It was a stark contrast to the people Eleanor had spent most of her life around. People who only helped when there was something in it for them. She glanced around the shelter, watching as volunteers handed out warm blankets, helped the elderly find a place to rest, and made sure no one left hungry. There was no glamour here, no expectation of reward, just genuine care. Maddie noticed her staring. Not what you expected. Eleanor let out a small chuckle. Not at all. Maddie smirked. Most people think shelters are just full of addicts or criminals. But really? It's people like my mom. People who just needed one thing to go right. Eleanor's stomach twisted. She had once thought the same way. She had judged from a distance, assuming that anyone in this position must have made bad choices. But looking around now, she realized the truth. Sometimes, life just wasn't fair. Maddie sighed, stirring the last bit of her soup. You know, most people I help don't even remember my name. They just take what they need and move on. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. That doesn't bother you? Maddie shrugged. It's not about me. It's about them. Eleanor exhaled, shaking her head. This girl had more wisdom than most people she knew in high society. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, Maddie leaned forward, her voice softer. What about you? What's your story? Eleanor stiffened. She had spent her whole life being known. This was the first time she had been invisible, and for some reason, she wasn't ready to change that yet. She forced a small smile. Just trying to figure things out. Maddie studied her for a long moment before nodding. Fair enough. Eleanor felt a pang of guilt. She had come here for an experiment, but now it felt like she was lying to someone who didn't deserve it. And deep down, she knew this secret wouldn't stay hidden for long. Eleanor lay awake that night in the shelter, staring at the ceiling. The room was dimly lit by a flickering street lamp outside, and the quiet murmurs of exhausted souls settling in for the night filled the air. She had never spent a night in a place like this. Her bed was usually a king-sized cloud of Egyptian cotton and silk sheets. Yet, this small cot, in this crowded room, felt more real than any night she had spent in her penthouse. She turned her head slightly and saw Maddie asleep on the cot beside hers, arms tucked under her head, her expression peaceful. How could someone with so little give so much? The question gnawed at her. The next morning, Eleanor was up before dawn. The shelter's volunteers had already begun preparing breakfast, and she decided to help. For the first time in years, she wasn't the one being served. She was the one serving. She poured coffee, handed out plates, and greeted people as they shuffled in. Maddie grinned when she spotted her. Didn't peg you for the volunteering type. Eleanor smirked. I'm full of surprises. But just as she spoke, her past caught up with her. A man in an expensive navy suit strolled into the shelter, looking completely out of place. He was well-groomed, his shoes polished to perfection. His eyes scanned the room before they landed on Eleanor and widened in shock. Ms. Kensington? Eleanor's blood ran cold. No, not here. Maddie frowned, glancing between them. Wait, you two know each other? Eleanor opened her mouth to speak, but the man had already stepped forward, his voice hushed but urgent. Ma'am, we've been looking everywhere for you. Your assistant is frantic. Maddie's eyes widened. The name Kensington finally registered. Eleanor Kensington, heiress to one of the wealthiest families in the country. Silence fell over the shelter. Everyone was staring. And just like that, her secret was out. The air in the shelter grew thick with tension. Maddie's expression had shifted, from warmth to something Eleanor couldn't quite read. The other people in the room whispered amongst themselves, some staring in disbelief, others with quiet understanding. Eleanor's heart pounded. This was not how she wanted the truth to come out. Maddie finally spoke, her voice careful but sharp. So, you're rich? Eleanor swallowed hard.
Yes.
Maddie exhaled sharply, shaking her head as if trying to process everything at once. This was all a test? Eleanor stepped forward. No. I mean, yes, at first. But then I met you. Maddie's jaw clenched. So what? You wanted to see how the poor live? Walk around in rags for a few days, then go back to your mansion and feel better about yourself? The word stung, because that had been exactly what Eleanor thought this would be in the beginning. A social experiment, a lesson in empathy, but it had become so much more. The man in the navy suit cleared his throat. Miss Kensington, your car is waiting. Eleanor ignored him. Her eyes stayed locked on Maddie's. I never meant to lie to you. Maddie crossed her arms. Then why didn't you tell me? Eleanor hesitated. The truth was, she had been afraid. Afraid Maddie would stop seeing her as a person. Afraid she would just become another billionaire to her. Because I didn't want you to treat me differently. Her voice was softer now, almost breaking. And because you were the first person in a long time who saw me for something other than my money. Maddie stared at her for a long moment, then let out a bitter laugh. Guess I was wrong. She turned sharply and walked out of the shelter. Eleanor felt a sinking feeling in her chest. For the first time in her life, she had lost something money couldn't buy, and she had no idea how to fix it. Eleanor stood frozen as Maddie disappeared into the streets. For years, she had walked away from people, from problems, from anything that made her uncomfortable. But this time, someone was walking away from her, and it hurt more than she ever imagined. The man in the navy suit cleared his throat again. Miss Kensington, shall we go? Eleanor turned to him, her jaw tightening.
No.
Without another word, she grabbed her coat and ran after Maddie, weaving through the crowded sidewalks, her heart hammering. She had to fix this. After a few blocks, she finally spotted Maddie sitting alone on a bench, arms crossed, staring at the pavement. Eleanor approached slowly. Can I sit? Maddie didn't answer, but she didn't tell her to leave either. Eleanor sat beside her, exhaling. You're mad. You have every right to be. Maddie scoffed. Mad? No. I just feel stupid. She turned to Eleanor, her eyes filled with disappointment. I thought I was helping someone who actually needed it. Instead, I was part of some rich woman's social experiment. Eleanor flinched. It wasn't like that. Maddie shook her head. Then what was it? Eleanor hesitated. How could she explain it? That this had started as an experiment, but had turned into something real? That Maddie had changed her in ways she never expected? She took a deep breath. I was blind, Maddie, my whole life. I lived in a world where money solved everything. I thought kindness was just another thing people bought. But then I met you. You gave without expecting anything. You didn't just see someone in need. You saw a person. And I wasn't ready for that. Maddie's lips pressed into a thin line. She wanted to stay angry, but something in Eleanor's voice sounded real. Eleanor sighed. You said earlier that true character is how you treat people when no one is watching. Well, I failed that test, but I want to be better. Maddie studied her, searching for any sign of deception. Finally, she exhaled. It's not about what you say. It's about what you do. Eleanor nodded. Then let me prove it. Maddie arched an eyebrow. How? Eleanor smiled faintly. She had an idea. Maddie leaned back against the bench, arms still crossed, but the tension in her shoulders had softened slightly. She wasn't convinced yet, but she was listening. Eleanor took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. I came into this thinking I was the one with something to teach, but I was wrong. You taught me more in a few days than I've learned in my entire life. Maddie let out a small, humorless chuckle. Yeah? And what exactly did I teach you? Eleanor met her gaze. That money doesn't make someone valuable. That kindness isn't weakness. That helping someone, even when no one is watching, is the greatest thing a person can do. Maddie swallowed hard. She wanted to stay angry, but there was something about the way Eleanor spoke. Like she wasn't just saying the right words, she actually believed them. Eleanor continued, her voice steady. I don't want to just apologize. I want to do something real. Something that matters. Maddie narrowed her eyes. Like what? Eleanor hesitated for a moment, then said, I want to help the shelter. Maddie's eyebrows lifted slightly. You mean, donate money? Eleanor shook her head. No. Well, yes, but not just that. She leaned forward. I want to build something permanent. A place where people like your mom, like the people in that shelter, don't have to wonder where their next meal is coming from. A real chance. Jobs, housing, education. Not just temporary help, actual change. Maddie stared at her, stunned. You're serious? Eleanor nodded. 100%. Maddie ran a hand through her hair, exhaling. Why? Why do you care now? Eleanor's expression softened. Because I saw what real kindness looks like. And I don't want to just admire it. I want to be part of it. Maddie looked away, biting her lip. She had spent her whole life believing that people like Eleanor only helped when there was something in it for them. But now she wasn't so sure. Finally, she sighed. Okay, prove it. Eleanor smiled, determination flashing in her eyes. I will. And this time, she wasn't just making a promise. She was making a commitment. The next morning, Eleanor was already up before the sun, standing outside Hope Haven with a phone pressed to her ear. If she was going to prove to Maddie that she was serious, she had to start now. I don't care how long it takes. Find out who owns the building and make them an offer, she said firmly. I want it bought and renovated within 6 months. The voice on the other end hesitated. Miss Kensington, that's a significant investment. Are you sure? Yes, she interrupted. And don't just throw money at it. I want real solutions. Job training, childcare, mental health support. Everything. She hung up just as Maddie stepped outside. Her expression was cautious. She had heard enough false promises in her life to know that words meant nothing without action. Eleanor turned to her. Come with me. Maddie frowned but followed. They walked through the city, past towering skyscrapers and high-end stores, until they reached a sleek, modern office building. Inside, Eleanor led her to a large conference room, where a group of suited executives sat waiting. As soon as she entered, they stood. Respect. Deference. Maddie had never seen anyone command a room like this. Eleanor motioned for Maddie to sit beside her. Then, she turned to the board. Effective immediately, I'm launching the Kensington Initiative." A murmur spread across the room. "We will fund permanent housing for struggling families. We will create employment programs for those who need a second chance. We will give people the tools to build their lives back." Her eyes flickered to Maddie. Because no one should have to rely on the kindness of strangers just to survive. Maddie stared at her, speechless. She hadn't expected this. Not at this scale. The board members exchanged glances. One of them cleared his throat. "Ms. Kensington, this is ambitious." Eleanor's expression hardened. "So was building this company from the ground up. And yet we did it." Silence. Then, one by one, they nodded. It was happening. Maddie leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. Finally, she exhaled. "Okay, I'll admit it. You're not all talk." Eleanor smirked. "Told you." But Maddie wasn't done testing her. "Let's see if you can actually pull it off." Eleanor's smile didn't waver. "Watch me." And for the first time in her life, she wasn't proving something for the world. She was proving it to herself. The next few weeks moved fast. Eleanor didn't just talk about change. She made it happen. The Kensington Initiative became more than just a concept. Contracts were signed. Buildings were secured. Programs were outlined. A full team was assembled to ensure that Hope Haven wouldn't just be a shelter. It would be a launching pad for new beginnings. Maddie was there for all of it, watching with cautious optimism. She wanted to believe Eleanor had changed, but years of disappointment had taught her to be careful. One afternoon, Eleanor showed up at the shelter in jeans and a simple sweater. No designer labels, no security entourage. Just her. Maddie raised an eyebrow. "No bodyguards today?" Eleanor smirked. "I figured if I'm going to be taken seriously, I need to show I'm in this for the long haul." Maddie crossed her arms. "And what does the long haul look like to a billionaire?" Eleanor motioned for her to follow. They walked through the shelter, past the rooms that would soon be remodeled, past the people whose lives would be changed. Finally, she stopped in front of a bulletin board filled with job listings and community resources. "It looks like giving people more than a roof over their heads," Eleanor said. "It looks like making sure no one has to depend on luck or kindness just to survive." Maddie studied her. She didn't see hesitation. She didn't see doubt. She saw determination. A slow smile crossed Maddie's lips. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe. "All right, Kensington, let's change some lives." Eleanor grinned. "Let's." And just like that, the girl who had once doubted her became her greatest ally. Because in the end, kindness wasn't about money. It was about action. And Eleanor was finally learning how to use her wealth for something that truly mattered. The grand opening of the Kensington Initiative was set for the following month. What had once been a struggling shelter was now transforming into a center for opportunity. New job training programs, mental health resources, permanent housing solutions, all of it was finally becoming real. Eleanor stood in the middle of the construction site, watching as workers installed new floors and fresh coats of paint. This wasn't just a donation. This was a legacy. Maddie approached, hands in her pockets, scanning the progress. "I'll admit it. You actually did it." Eleanor smirked. "Did you ever doubt me?" Maddie gave her a look. "Constantly." They both laughed, the tension that had once existed between them finally gone. Maddie's expression softened. "You know, most rich people don't even look at places like this, let alone build them." Eleanor exhaled. "Because I was one of them. Until I realized that all my money meant nothing if I wasn't using it to change lives." Maddie nodded, then hesitated before asking, "So, what now?" Eleanor thought for a moment, then smiled. "Now, we keep going. She turned to the building, eyes shining with a sense of purpose she had never felt before. This was just the beginning, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't chasing wealth. She was chasing impact. The day of the grand opening arrived, and the once faded shelter now stood as a beacon of hope. The Kensington Initiative had become more than just a name. It was a movement. People gathered outside, from reporters to local officials, but Eleanor's focus was elsewhere. She wasn't here for the cameras. She was here for the people whose lives were about to change. Maddie stood beside her, arms crossed, a small smirk on her face. "So, Miss Billionaire, how does it feel to actually follow through on something?" Eleanor chuckled. "Feels better than I expected." As the event began, Eleanor took the stage. She had given plenty of speeches before, but this one felt different. She took a deep breath. "For most of my life, I thought success was measured by what you own. But I was wrong. True success is measured by how much you give." The crowd fell silent. This wasn't the Eleanor Kensington they expected. She continued, "I came here thinking I was going to learn about struggle, but what I really learned was resilience, kindness, and the power of second chances." She glanced at Maddie, who gave her an approving nod. "This isn't just a shelter. It's a future. And today, we take the first step towards something greater." As she stepped back, the crowd erupted in applause. But Eleanor wasn't focused on the noise. She was focused on the impact. Maddie nudged her. "Not bad, Kensington. Not bad at all." Eleanor smiled. For the first time in her life, she wasn't just proud of what she had built. She was proud of who she had become. And she knew this was only the beginning. As the event ended and the crowd began to disperse, Eleanor stood in front of the newly renovated Kensington Initiative building, taking it all in. The place that once held only desperation now radiated hope. Maddie stood beside her, watching as families walked through the doors, not just for shelter, but for a chance at something better. "You really did it," Maddie said softly. Eleanor exhaled, her heart full in a way money had never been able to accomplish. "We did it." Maddie smirked. "You know, I never thought I'd say this, but maybe rich people aren't all bad." Eleanor chuckled. "Careful, Maddie. That almost sounded like a compliment." They laughed, but deep down, Eleanor knew that this moment, this choice to step beyond her privilege and use her wealth for good, was the most important thing she had ever done. As she turned to leave, Maddie called out, "So, what's next for Eleanor Kensington?" Eleanor glanced back, a confident smile forming on her lips. "Whatever makes the world better." She walked away, not toward a luxury car or a high-rise penthouse, but toward a future she had finally chosen for herself. And this time, she wasn't just rich in wealth. She was rich in purpose.